So before we talk about this timber harvest, I think it's important to understand the last 20, 25 years of forest management on Spring Island, and most especially how it relates to the trust. And obviously, the trust was set up to manage for an ecological benefit the different preserves, the Colleton Preserve and the Chichesi Preserve. Over the years, larger blocks of that acreage has been managed for fire maintained pine savanna. So if you think of Osprey Woods, you think of Big Neck, you think of the Clay Range Woods. The reason those areas have been managed for those habitat types is because they aren't as common. They are not the result of lack of management. To have those sort of fire maintained, herbaceous dominated, pine overstory habitats are a conscious decision is made by the landowner. But those are increasingly rare habitats throughout the southeast, which means they are especially valuable to a variety of species. That kind of sets up what's been happening with a lot of those areas throughout the two different preserves. About 4 or 5 years ago, we started looking at other areas outside of those Osprey Woods, Big Neck, Little Neck, other areas, saying, are there not other areas within the trust-owned properties where they can be enhanced through greater forest management? And we found a common theme. There were a lot of areas where the timber was not managed such that there was a profusion of not only pines, but also hardwoods, laurel oak, water oak, sweet gum, all of which are perfectly fine habitat, but they are not incredibly rare in Beaufort County. Laurel oak and water oak is the result of lack of management and occurs everywhere. And the species that utilize those habitats are not declining. Species that utilize fire-maintained habitats are declining because those habitats are not as common. So both through the land management team and working with Chris and Carl, we started to talk about a timber harvest where we could modify the structure, the vegetative architecture of the forest so that we could promote more fire-maintained habitats. So indeed, that's what we did. We went through systematically and looked at all of the different trust-owned parcels and asked, of these different areas, can it be enhanced? That's not to say that every area that had a water oak or a laurel oak we went into. There were other areas that had some of those oak species that had valuable shrub understory that Chris wanted to retain for songbird nesting habitat for a couple of different species. There were other areas that were maybe provided some buffer to Spring Island Drive, and so for an aesthetic reason it was important to keep that. But even with that, considering those areas and leaving them alone, we still found 130 to 140 acres on the trust property that said the forest structure here can be improved such that we can make more valuable habitat. The general goal was to remove both hardwoods, laurel oak, water oak, sweet gum, some other miscellaneous species, but by and large those were the predominant ones. Pine, some pine, whether it might be diseased like around hole 4 or it might just be poor form. Remove those trees from the forest. What was occurring before the timber harvest is you had this density of regenerating tree species, all of which were competing for sunlight above and nutrients and moisture down below. Those are very limited things within a particular area. And so if you have a high density of trees, all those trees are going to be competing for those resources. So much so that some of those trees become stressed and become poor form. So by taking out some of those poor form, diseased trees, laurel oaks, water oaks, we can eliminate those and leave the best quality, strongest trees in the forest. What that also does is it opens up the canopy so that we can then get more sunlight to the forest floor. That's one of the most important keys to developing that herbaceous understory. When we harvested those areas, one of the major benefits was to open up the canopy so that we can allow sunlight to get to the forest floor. When we do that, that's one of the primary keys needed to promote a herbaceous understory. You need sunlight so that those herbaceous and forb species can grow. We've done that now. And so as these areas, as we begin to manage them more intensively with fire, we will be able to maintain that herbaceous understory in these 130 plus acres, overall making the trust properties even more ecologically valuable. The other consideration is not just from creating valuable habitat, is the trees themselves were stressed. So if you take a particular area and you allow as many pine trees to regenerate as possible, those trees are going to compete. And they can be thick as dog hair.
Yeah.
And so what happens is those trees, some might do well, might pop up and might be able to capture more sunlight, but the vast majority of them are all going to suffer. When you do that, those trees are under stress. That's a concern because when a stand of timber is under stress, it's highly susceptible to certain pathogens, most especially pine beetle damage. And there's a handful of different pine beetle species, all of which would have a field day in what we call an overstocked or an incredibly dense stand, an overstocked pine stand where all the trees were under stress. When you combine that with the what luckily was a lucky scenario, when the hurricane came through, it jostled a lot of those trees, some of which of course fell, some of which were at an angle, but there are a lot of trees that are still standing and look like they're fine, but the fine root system that's responsible for nutrient and water uptake have all been severed. And so you combine that with potentially some of these areas where the trees were already under stress, that could be a real recipe for significant tree mortality this coming growing season, what we're going into right now, spring of 2017. So now that a lot of those areas have been thinned, those trees have got greater growing room, and hopefully if they have had the significant fine root damage, they'll be able to get through this because they aren't under stress anymore. The competition has been reduced. So, well, they become more stressed. So think about a large pine tree that might be, 20 or 24 inches in diameter. That seems like a very large tree. Corresponding to that large tree is a large canopy above. And if that canopy is catching a lot of wind, that tree is going to get moved around as that wind blows through the course of the hurricane. Well, at the end of the hurricane, some of them have been blown over, some were blown at an angle, but some of them might still be standing straight up. So if you went out and just judged the tree impact based off of the angle of the tree, had it fallen or is it at some angle, you would miss all of those trees that are at 90 degrees. But in fact, what's happened below grade is the structural roots are still there, but the fine roots have been severed. And that's what's really problematic when you begin to think about tree goes, at the end of the hurricane, we were coming out of the growing season. Trees were going dormant anyway. Well, now as those trees try to become physiologically active in 2017, they're trying to depend on the fine root system that they used to have, and it's not there anymore.
So they may die.
They might. Yeah, we might still have some tree mortality. We've done as much as we can by evaluating trees. If we saw any suggestions that perhaps they were compromised, for example, in the Osprey Woods, we harvested some trees that were straight up. And the reason was, as I went through that stand and I looked in the canopy with my binoculars, I could begin to see some browning of the canopy throughout the canopy. And that to me was a clue that, that tree is under stress. And in fact, those trees where I found browning in the canopy, I found some pine beetle damage on the stem of the tree anyway. So if you just judge it, say, well, we're only going to take trees that had fallen or trees at an angle, you would have missed this entire cohort of trees that are still going to be a problem next growing season. So we tried to mitigate that impact by going ahead very thoughtfully and looking at these particular areas and saying, what's going on here? Which trees do we need to take? And for example, the area by number 4, the decision there to remove the vast majority of the trees is because they had something called fusiform rust, which creates a stressed tree. Some of the trees will die, and they just weren't stable. Those trees were not going to grow to be grand trees because of this virus that had impacted the structural component of the stem. So it made sense to remove all those trees. So what happens, Folkland Management and Clay Folk being the registered forester, prepares, and me being the wildlife biologist, we prepare a timber sale. So we've worked with Chris and Carl, the trust. Before we even talk to a timber buyer, we say, okay, what do we want to sell? I've talked about the ecological reasons why we want to sell, and there's certainly some aesthetic ones. But once we've decided what it is we want to sell, we then quantify that. Once we quantify that, we can then turn to a series of timber buyers and say, okay, I have this 130 acres in Beaufort County, and this is the wood. This is what needs to come off. These are the different areas that we would harvest. And each one of those timber buyers would come out and look at it, and they would make a judgment. They would say, okay, I'll pay you X amount per ton of forest product. So it might have been per ton of hardwood pulpwood. It might have been per ton of pine pulpwood. So they would come out and give us a price per unit volume. Each one of those would give us prices, and then we made the judgment on which prices obviously were the best. We only offered that wood to loggers that we trusted. So folks that we worked with before and we knew would do a good job. So if you take that off the table, then by and large you can go with the price that's the highest. And in this case, because it was right after the storm, we had to go with somebody that could move quite quickly. So that was also influenced the case. The way it works on their end is a timber buyer will buy the wood. That timber buyer then contracts with a logger to do to harvest the timber and take it to the mill. So the logger is getting paid from the timber buyer. The logger isn't getting paid from us, from Spring Island.
Interesting. So he's the timber buyer is the middleman in a way.
Exactly. And so
and where does is the timber buyer also the sawmill?
No, not in all cases. Sometimes sawmills will have their own timber buyers, but in other cases there are standalone companies that's what they do. They buy wood and they sell it to the mill. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it used to be that the timber companies, the really big ones, would have their own timberlands, so they would supply all the wood they needed for their mill based off of the land that they own. Probably in the early to mid '90s. And that had been the model really from the 60s and 70s right through the 80s and the 90s. During the 90s, timberlands started to divest themselves of that acreage. They realized, they said, you know what, we don't need to own all this timberland, and we can buy the wood we need for our mill on the open market. The other thing that influenced that is land values, especially along the coast, really started to skyrocket. So they looked at the marketplace and the supply of wood, and they said, makes no sense for us to hold on to this 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 acres in South Carolina when we can go ahead and sell that acreage, gain that money, and then just buy wood off the open market. So I think a lot of folks think he is anti-timber harvest, and he's not. He is... He promotes wise stewardship of forest. And in the Southeast, these are not virgin forest. These are highly impacted forest for hundreds of years. And as a result, if we want these forests to have certain characteristics, whether they be valuable ecologically, or whether they be valuable revenue generators, for example, family farms. A lot of family farms are now pine forest. Those pine forests need to be managed to generate the maximum amount of revenue for that family so they can hold on to their family farm. So that, without speaking for Dana, I think he definitely promotes wise stewardship of timberlands. He would much rather see acreage in the hands of somebody who's going to manage the timber, whether it be for ecological purposes or financial purposes, rather than a Walmart built on top of it or something like that. And he's willing to go to court to make his point. And in the world of conservation, you need a lot of different tools. and he is one very effective tool. He's willing to organize the lawyers and the Southern Environmental Law Center and take people to court.
How long have you been working with Spring Island?
So let's see. Our dad started before there was a bridge, and so that was in the late '80s. And in fact, one, if not two, of the first timber harvest were actually done before the bridge. So they would use barges to bring the log trucks on and off the island. I got back from graduate school in 2006 and started working in folk land management. And my brother, the registered forester, he started working in folk land management fairly soon thereafter. He got a bachelor's in forestry and then Marine Corps. And so we both finished up our different pursuits at the same time.
So it's you and your brother now?
Yep, Dad still comes into the office.
Uh-huh.
He still comes to the land management team meetings and stuff like that.
So when you're talking about land management, it's not just forestry, you're also overseeing the controlled burns and stuff on Spring Island, or telling them what to do this, or?
Clay's in charge of that.
Uh-huh.
He is our resident prescribed fire manager, our pyro,
Mhm.
and so he handles all that. He works with Carl to determine where are we going to burn, how are we going to burn. So yeah, they handle that. I help with a lot of the wetlands issues. So both
Like the rebuilding the rice trunk for the shrimp pond.
yeah, that was my project. Yep, that and the Great Salt Pond project. So yeah, we help out in a variety of ways. We've organized Chinese tallow hackathons where folks go out and hack and score.
With Al Gerber.
Al Gerber, yep.
Yeah.
And some of the longleaf planting, we've helped organize that as well. So yeah, whole variety of different things.